All right, so for this game, so this one's got a few things going on. So this might have been a bit of a tougher one to set up. But essentially what we have to do here, what we're keeping track of is we've got these two people, and for each of them, from Frank and Gloria, we need to completely set up their visiting schedule to the city. So each of them is going to visit 3 cities, and we have to figure out the sequential order of the cities that they're going to visit. Now, generally speaking, if you have a sequential component to the game, you should let that drive the chart. But if you weren't sure about how exactly to set everything up, one thing that you could have done here is you could have taken a quick look at the exclusion question. The exclusion question is not always guaranteed to give you kind of an ideal setup, but they almost always do. They almost always give you a viable setup that you can work with. So that's a pretty good hint. And essentially what we're doing here is we have 3 positions, 1, 2, and 3. And we have to figure out the complete sequential setup for both of these people. So we can set up a 2-tiered game. We have to figure out a sequence for Frank and a sequence for Gloria. Now, when it comes to both of them, essentially, they're going to be visiting 3 out of these 4 cities. So they're both going to have effectively an out. So what we'll do is we'll also keep track of that. And if you have a defined out, it's always useful to be able to kind of specifically track the one or the defined number of spaces that are out. So we'll set up an out column as well. Now from there, the elements themselves, we just have the 4 cities, H, M, S, and T. And I suppose we can go into the rules. So the first rule says that anybody visiting Montreal also has to visit Toronto right after. So if we have an M, then we'll have to have an MT block. Now, there is a deduction that we can actually make based on this rule, and it's based on a bit of a pattern that you really want to make sure that you get used to, because LSAT loves using this pattern somewhat frequently. You probably won't see this on every test, but it happens kind of enough that it's noticeable. And the pattern essentially is that if you ever have a game in which there's a lot of different ways that this can manifest itself, but if you ever have a situation in which you have a set of things, and of those things, only one will be not selected, only one will be effectively out. So for example, in this game, for each of these 2 people, we're going to select 3 out of 4 people, or 3 out of 4 cities rather. So 1 city will be out. Anytime you're selecting basically a number of things, but only 1 will be out, so it can be 2 out of 3, or in this case, 3 out of 4, 4 out of 5. And if you also have a conditional rule that says that if you have one element, then you're also going to have another element, you can make a minor deduction that says that the other element, the one that is getting dragged in, always has to be among those selected. So in this case, we know that if you have an M, you're also going to have to drag in a T. And yeah, they have to be in a certain sequence, but that's kind of beside the point. If you have an M, you'll have to have a T. Essentially, that dictates that T will have to permanently be selected. It's always going to be one of the 3 cities that are in. The reason for that is, well, there's a couple ways we can look at this. So one way you can look at this is that, well, M is going to be either in or out, right? Everything is going to be on one or the other. But if you have an M on the inside, then obviously you'll have to have a T on the inside as well. But if M was to go on the outside, well, then everybody else would have to be in, and that includes T. So T is still going to be on the inside. No matter which way you go, T is going to be in. Another way you could have looked at this is that consider the contrapositive. This rule, the contrapositive here would basically say that, or at least part of what it would say is that if you don't have a T, then you won't be able to have an M. But then if you don't have a T, you'll also have to kick out M, and then 2 people will be out. But we can't do that. We can't fit 2 people out. So there's no way to ever kick out the T, because then you would also have to get rid of M, and that wouldn't work. So in this game, we can make a minor deduction that basically says that T has to always be in. T is never going to be on the outside. And again, as a general rule of thumb, if you have a situation like this whereby you're selecting things but only one is out, and if you have a rule that goes something like if you have an X, then you also have to have a Y, essentially the Y will always be on the inside. It will be among the ones selected. Anyways, next. Second rule tells us that if we have Gloria going to Houston, then Frank has to go to Montreal. So if Gloria gets Houston, then Frank gets Montreal. And I suppose we have to also have a T that will follow the M right there. So we can kind of combine those rules together. Now, beyond that, it's a little situational, because we don't know if Gloria actually goes to Houston. But if she goes to Houston, then yes, we definitely will have to have an MT block. Next, if Frank goes to Houston, then he'll also have to, or he will later visit Seattle. So if Frank goes to Houston, then we'll have to have what is effectively H before S. And you'll notice that this last rule also kind of has the same pattern as the first one here, which is that notice what's happening here. If we have Frank going to Houston, he will also have to go to Seattle as well, which means Seattle has to be in for Frank. Seattle has to be one of Frank's cities, because if you didn't have Frank going to Seattle, then he wouldn't be able to go to Houston either, so they would both end up being out, and we can't really do that. So we can say that Seattle for Frank will never be on the outside. Seattle is definitely going to be one of Frank's cities. So that's pretty good for Frank. We've nailed down 2 of his 3 cities, right? He's definitely going to have T, and he's definitely going to have S. So that's pretty good. For Gloria, however, I guess we have a little bit more flexibility. Gloria is definitely going to have Toronto as one of her cities, but we don't know much more. So you know what? Let's take a look at the questions. All right, so question 1, which of the following could be a complete setup of the game? And as usual, we do this by the original set of rules. So the first rule was that every M has to have a T right after. So let's take a look. Answer choice A has 2 sets of MT, so that's fine. B has Gloria with M, but there's also a T right after, so that's cool. Answer choice C, you'll notice, doesn't work. We have an M without a T following for Frank, so we can get rid of C. Answer choice D has Montreal and Frank, but there's Toronto there as well, so we're good. And E, ooh, that doesn't work. Gloria has M and T in the wrong order, so we can get rid of that one. Next, and the second rule, if Gloria goes to Houston, then Frank has to essentially get M and T as well. So answer choice A, Gloria doesn't have Houston, so it doesn't apply. Answer choice B, Gloria has Houston, but there's no M for Frank, so we can get rid of B. And D, Gloria has Houston, but we do have MT for Frank, so that's fine. Next, last rule, if Frank has Houston, then you have to have Seattle following. So between A and D, Frank has Houston in A, but there's no Seattle, so we can get rid of that. And D, there's no Houston, so we're good. Best answer to question number 1 then is answer choice D. Now, as usual, I suppose we can plug that into the board. So D gives us MTS for Frank, and I guess that would leave us with H on the outside, and then HST for Gloria, which leaves us with M on the outside. So from there, let's take a look. The first local question here looks like number 3. So we have if F and G both visit Montreal. Okay, so that's pretty good. So if Montreal has to go, so we're going to have an MT block, and that's going to be for both F and G. So what does that tell us? Well, actually, wait a minute. When it comes to Frank, we know that Frank always has to have Seattle, right? And you'll notice we can't really have Frank doing Houston, because then he would have to do Houston and Seattle, and there's no room because we already have an M and a T, which means that for Frank, we don't know the exact sequence, but essentially Frank's 3 cities are going to have to be an MT block, and Seattle is just going to shuffle them, and then Houston is going to be out. Now, when it comes to G on the other side, oh, well, wait a minute. We know that, and we kind of glossed over this earlier, but we do know that according to the original setup, they did tell us that every single city has to show up. So at some point, they do say that every city must be visited by at least one of the reps. So that means that if H is out for Frank, then Gloria is going to have H because we need H to be visited by one or the other person, which means that Gloria's cities are going to be MT as per the question, and she will also have to have Houston as well, and so for her, Seattle is going to be the one who is out. Let's take a look. The question asks what could be true. Answer choice A, Houston is the second city for Frank, and no, you'll notice that for both of them, if they have an empty block, then it's going to end up having to kind of cover up the second position. It's either going to go in 1 and 2, or it's going to go into 2 and 3. But the second position is essentially going to have to be either M or T. So Houston can't be the second city for Frank, and for that matter, it also can't be the second city for Gloria. So A and B are both out. Next, Seattle is the first city for Frank. And actually, yeah, maybe for Frank, we could have S, M, T. That actually seems viable. So C looks pretty good. Just in case, though, let's take a look at D and E. Seattle's the third city for Gloria, and no, Gloria currently does not visit Seattle. And Toronto is the first city for Gloria. Also no, because she has to have an empty block. So the best answer to question number 3 is C. Next, question number 4. If Toronto is the first city that Gloria visits, so I guess let's play that out. If Gloria's first city is Toronto, well, right away, that means that she can't really visit Montreal, right? Because there's no way to have an empty block anymore. So M for her is going to have to be out. Now, can we do anything else with that? Well, I suppose her other two cities are now going to have to be H and S. And even though we don't exactly know the exact sequence of H and S, we do know that she's doing H now, right? She is going to Houston, and we know that if she goes to Houston, then Frank has to go to Montreal. Although I suppose we actually knew that either way, because if Montreal is out for Gloria, then somebody has to go to Montreal. It's going to have to be Frank. So Frank is going to definitely have an empty block. Oh, and as we said, as usual, Frank also always goes to Seattle, right? That's permanent. So we know that Frank cities are going to be essentially an empty block with Seattle, and that would mean that Houston is out. So to the question now, which of the following cannot be true? Frank visits Houston, and yeah, that can't be true. Frank's Houston is out, so the best answer here is answer choice A. Just in case, though, we can take a look at the rest. Frank goes to Montreal, and that's true. Frank goes to Toronto, that is true. Gloria goes to Houston, that is also true. And Gloria goes to Seattle, that's also true. So yeah, the best answer still remains answer choice A. Next, 5's global. We'll come back to this one in a second. Let's take a look at question 6. We've got, if the second city for Frank is Seattle, well, if Frank's second city is Seattle, I suppose what does that tell us? Well, at the very least, it definitely means that Frank can't do an MT block anymore, right? There's no way to fit it in, which means that he can't really do M because M would have required an empty block. So M is going to be out for Frank, which means that everything else is in. H is going to be in. Oh, and if Frank does H, then H has to come before Seattle. So we know that H is going to be first and T is going to be third. So that's a good start. What else do we know? Oh, well, we do also know that since M is out for Frank, then somebody has to go to Montreal, right? So Montreal is definitely going to go to Gloria. So Gloria is going to end up with an MT block for sure. And otherwise, I don't think she has to do anything specific. I think from here, it could go either way. So let's take a look. The question now asks what must be true. Answer choice A, Frank's city, first city is Montreal. And no, in fact, Frank doesn't do Montreal at all. The third city for Frank is Toronto. And yeah, that does in fact have to be true. We know that Frank's third is in fact Toronto. Best answer to question number 6 is B. Now, just in case, let's take a look at the rest. C, the first city for Gloria is Seattle. Now, that could be true, but it doesn't have to, so we can get rid of that. The second city for Gloria, in fact, you'll notice that Gloria's cities, we don't have an exact positioning for any of them, so we can't really commit to the idea that any particular city will have to be any specific one. So that would have disqualified D and E. So once again, best answer here was B. Next, back to the globals. Question number 2. Which of the following could be Frank's itinerary in sequence? Now, Let's start with the easy stuff. We definitely know that Frank we have to have T on there and we have to have S on there, right? Because we said for Frank, T and S are always in. So we can get rid of any answer choice that's missing one of them. So A doesn't have an S. We can get rid of that. Answer choice B looks okay. Answer choice C has no T, so we can get rid of that. Answer choice D has T and S. That's still okay. And E still has them both. Next, what else do we know about Frank? Well, I suppose we know that, if we have an M there, we'll have to have an MT block. So that would get rid of answer choice E, M can't be last. And we know that if Frank does Houston, then they have to go in that sequence. So that would, between B and D, that would get rid of D because we know that we can't have S before H. So best answer here is answer choice B for question 2. Lastly, question number 5. What must be true? Answer choice A, Frank does Houston. And no, in fact, we've seen historically cases where Frank didn't do Houston, so that's certainly out. Frank goes to Montreal. And actually, yeah, we've also seen Frank not go to Montreal. That doesn't have to be true. Gloria goes to Houston. And to be fair, we haven't seen her not go to Houston. Although in the last scenario, this could have flipped, right? She could have not gone to Houston or Seattle. Answer choice D, Gloria goes to Seattle. Same thing. She could have been out in that scenario. Answer choice E, Gloria goes to Toronto. And yeah, because we know that we early on said everybody goes to Toronto. So the best answer to question number 5 is